Hello and welcome to the Healthy Yards Irrigation Program, where we help you get the most out of your irrigation system. Today, I'm going to be walking you through how you can install a micro-irrigation system in your home landscape. And my name is Jackie Lebouitz. I am the Water Resources Program Assistant at IFAS Extension, Sarasota County. So let's dive in. In this presentation, we're going to be going over what kind of materials you'll need to set up a system, followed by a step-by-step installation guide. And then at the end, we'll go over some tips to help you have a successful time setting up your drip. Here's a basic list of materials you can purchase to create your standard micro-irrigation system. Of course, the first and most important thing you're going to want to get is drip tubing. We'll get a little more into the specific sizes and functions of different tubing later on, but this is going to be the heart of your system. To be able to cut and measure your tubing, you'll need shears and measuring tape. The pieces that connect to your tubing and distribute water are called emitters, and there are many different kinds, but that's another essential part of your system. Ground stakes are going to hold your pipes in place. The end piece is a little figure 8 that cuts off water flow so you can make sure your water goes exactly where it needs to go. And fittings are meant to help you connect your pieces of drip tubing together, which makes for a more flexible and versatile system. The hole punch is essential. You're going to need it to punch holes for connecting your emitters and fittings to your drip tubing. And if you mess up and puncture holes in your tubing where you don't need them, go ahead and get yourself some goof plugs. They just plug in your pipe and prevent water from escaping. So for setting up your initial system from your main water source, you're going to need a backflow prevention device to prevent gunk from getting into your water system, a filter to prevent gunk from clogging your pipes as water flows from your source through the system, a pressure regulator or pressure regulated pipes. This is extra important because micro-irrigation emitters are developed for a low flow, low pressure system, unlike your typical spray head or outdoor hose. Those are high pressure, high flow devices. So you need to regulate that pressure so that your pipes don't explode. Adapters, as the name implies, adapt to the size of your drip tubing. So if your hose bib had a 1-inch diameter, but your drip tubing had a 1/2-inch diameter, you could get an adapter that fits your hose bib to your tubing. And finally, if you don't already have an irrigation system with an automatic timer, you might want to buy one to allow for a more hands-off irrigation experience. Another option, which honestly I very much recommend, are shut-off valves that you can connect to your tubing. This is great for shutting off water flow to certain areas of your landscape where you might not want it. For instance, let's say you just planted some low water use plants. They would need consistent watering while they got established, but then you could turn off your system afterwards since they're not going to need supplemental watering throughout most of the year. Last but not least, you may want to invest in some mulch to help you cover up your tubing. This will help it blend into the landscape and serve the dual purpose of retaining water in the soil. So I know that's a lot of information to have at once, but we're going to see how some of these pieces will fit together in a fully functional micro-irrigation system in just a bit. So those are some of the components you're going to want to buy for your drip system. But now it's time to get into some of the steps of setting up your system. So I'm going to spend the next part of the presentation showing you the 10 steps to success when building your drip system. Step 1. If you haven't already, you're going to want to map out your yard and existing irrigation system if you have one. You can use the Sarasota County Property Appraiser website to get an outline of your property, and once you print it out, familiarize yourself with where everything is in your yard and mark it on the map. Take note of your irrigation zones if you have any set up and what kind of plants are in them, whether they're shrubs, trees, ground covers, turf, etc. From there, mark where your spray heads are and what kind of heads they are. While you have your map, also mark where your controller is, where your rain sensor is, and any valve boxes around the property, and of course your outdoor faucets if you're setting up a manual micro-irrigation system. So your finished product might look a little bit like this, but seriously, feel free to get creative and make whatever kind of map is going to be the most useful for you. So in this map, we have banana trees in Zone 1. Zone 2, we have where most of our turf is. Zone 3 is perennial peanut, which is a very low water use plant. And then in the front, we have our landscape shrubs in mulched beds. So we have some jatropha and firebush. I marked where my existing spray heads are in orange, and there are 2 in each zone except for zone 4, where I have my jatropha and firebush in mulched beds. So remember that your map is probably going to look a lot different. You might have more or less than 4 zones, and your plants may not be so neatly organized. My word of advice here is just do your best. Whatever you have and make is not only going to be incredibly useful for planning your system, but it's also going to be a great help when you're getting repairs done on your irrigation system or for any other planned outdoor projects. Anyways, after you get your map in order, it's important that you ask yourself these questions before proceeding with buying materials. First, ask yourself where in the yard drip would work best. So, for instance, I had 3 zones in my yard map where I could see micro-irrigation being a good choice. My jatropha and firebush shrubs, my banana trees in the back of the house, and finally, my perennial peanut. So this one's a bit situational actually, and I'll get more into that in a bit. But after you figure out where drip is going to be the most useful, you have to think about how you're going to get the water from your main water source to the plants you want to irrigate. Are you going to be converting one of your sprinklers into a drip system? Are you connecting to an outdoor faucet instead? Do you need to get an irrigation timer, or do you already have one? And if you're going to use shutoff valves in certain parts of your system, where are you going to put them? So asking yourself these questions can help you visualize your future micro-irrigation system and help you figure out what components you're going to need to buy. After all, not every single item I listed on the materials page is going to apply to you and your system. So, back to your yard map. You should now have a good idea of what plants are in your landscape and what irrigation zones they fall into. Like I said before, I identified 3 zones where I could implement a drip irrigation system. For my system, I determined that I want to take my pre-existing spray heads and retrofit them into a micro-irrigation system. So now you want to take a copy of your map and draw in your tubing where you want to see it. This is going to take some careful thinking and consideration, since you want to make sure you're using just the necessary materials and the most practical setup. So for my zone 1, I have my 2 banana trees. For trees that are just getting established or need a little bit of supplemental watering throughout the year, you want to circle the tree roots with inline drip tubing. You still want to separate the trunk and the tubing by a few inches, since the root system is usually much wider than the trunk. You could retrofit 2 of your sprinklers like I did in the diagram, or if you want to cut down on the work, you could retrofit one, cap the other, and run tubing from one site to the other. For zone 3, we have our perennial peanut. So normally, perennial peanut does not need supplemental watering except for in really dry weather. However, when you have new plantings, they do require some extra water to get established. In this case, I capped off one of the 2 sprinklers in this zone, and I adapted the other into a micro-irrigation system. So there are a few choices of setup here. You could run inline drip tubing through the perennial peanut if you have a particularly dense patch, but if you only have a few plantings spaced apart, you can set up some spaghetti tubing with drip emitters. I mean, there are a lot of choices you can make here, and it's up to you and what you think is the most practical for your plants. So a final example for zone 4, we have our jatropha and firebush shrubs in a mulched landscape bed. There's 1 sprinkler in this zone, so we're actually going to use a pressure compensating drip manifold. These essentially just screw onto your water source where your spray head once was, and they come with a set of connectors. So you can just attach spaghetti tubing to the ones you want to use and cap off the ones you don't. So they're a really easy choice for small contained plant beds. So now you've developed an action plan for what to get for your micro-irrigation system. Keep in mind that some emitters and tubing sizes may be more useful in some parts of your landscape than others. Try to make the most practical choice for your yard, and know that there are always future opportunities to adapt your system to work for you better. The beautiful thing about micro-irrigation is that once you set it up, you can change it however you like. So you got your plan in place. Now it's time to get ready for the fun parts. For larger stretches of area, you're going to want to acquire some mainline tubing. Mainline just means that it's the primary tube that all your other tubes and emitters are connected to. There are so many different sizes of tubing, but an easy choice is to go with the 1/2-inch poly tubing that you can find at most of your major home improvement stores. Now, you can just add emitters directly to your mainline tubing, but spaghetti tubing is going to give you more access to areas throughout your landscape. This also comes in various sizes, but a 1/4-inch tubing is one of the more popular picks. Generally speaking, unless you have certain areas that you need it, you may want to avoid inline drip tubing. I say this because it comes with a certain amount of pre-spaced holes, and it's much easier to just punch holes where you need them instead of trying to plug up a bunch of holes that you're not going to use. And in a lot of cases, you can't really plug up the holes in drip line tubing. For trees and really dense patches of plants like ground covers, sure, go ahead and grab yourself a small roll of it. Otherwise, try to look for tubing that doesn't have any holes. So once you have your tubing situation figured out, now it's time to set up your mainline tubing. Yes, exciting. Before you get started, locate your source of water. Like we discussed before, that could be an outdoor faucet, replacing a spray head, or connected to your valve box. Be sure that your water source has backflow prevention, a filter, a pressure regulator or pressure regulated tubing, and an adapter to help you fit your tubing together. You can always get yourself a clamp instead of an adapter, but just proceed with caution if you're not super familiar with working with your system. Once you get that initial setup done, you can attach your main line and weave it through your plant beds and throughout the rest of your zone as desired. Once you find a good place to cut off your system, clip it with shears and use your figure 8 end piece to cut it off. Weave the pipe through the first hole and then back through the other hole. Use metal or plastic stakes to secure your main line in the soil, and that's going to stop it from wiggling around on windy or rainy days. So step 6 is for people who do want to use spaghetti tubing in their micro-irrigation system. Note that not all systems need to have the spaghetti tubing, but that it helps increase the area that your water can get to throughout your landscape. So if you do decide you want it, use your measuring tape to determine how long you want your spaghetti tubing to be for each end destination. So for instance, if you had 5 plants that are each 6 inches away from your mainline drip, you would cut 5 6-inch pieces of tube. I actually recommend being a little generous here because depending on the situation, you might want to add an extra inch to some measurements. For instance, if you're going to be threading your tubing through a plastic stake, that's going to add some height to your tubing. So then you have to account for the height and the length. Basically, you can always cut your tubing down if you need to. It's just good to be prepared. Once you have your pieces together, it doesn't hurt to label them with some masking tape and a permanent marker. That way, you know what's going where. Once you have your spaghetti tubing cut, labeled, and ready to go, you can attach them to your mainline tubing using fittings. All right, so I know there's a lot on the screen all at once, but this is definitely where most of the work comes in. You can use fittings to bring your tubes together so that all the water flow is connected. There are many different kinds, but the ones that are most important for a basic system are connectors. Connectors are important for joining your spaghetti tubing to your mainline tubing. And if you want multiple pieces of spaghetti tubing coming from the same hole, you can use something called a micro-T. If you decide that you want to run another piece of mainline tubing through your landscape, you can connect it with a regular T fitting. And this is a great choice if you have certain sections of your landscape that need less water than other sections. Then you can install a shutoff valve in your new mainline and keep it turned off until you need to water. Elbow fittings are good if you want to angle your tubing at a 90-degree angle, and this gives you some more design options with your mainline tubing. Otherwise, it's really important to note that if you're going to be adding micro-Ts and barbed connectors to your mainline tubing, and again, this is to attach the smaller spaghetti tubing, you're going to need a hole punch. Honestly, you're going to need a hole punch for nearly all micro-irrigation systems. It's this funky little orange critter right here, and though they come in many different colors and sizes, they all essentially do the same thing. You punch it into your mainline tubing, and then you get a hole where you can attach your fittings. So from there, you connect your freshly cut spaghetti tubing to your main line as you had it planned out in your yard map. And like I said, if you're not doing spaghetti tubing, perfectly fine. You can use that hole to connect the emitters directly to your main line. Speaking of emitters, now we're going to get into step 8. So this is setting up your emitters to your main line or your spaghetti tubing. So there are 4 main types of micro-irrigation emitters. In the order of this picture, starting from the top left, we have a micro bubbler, inline drip tubing, a drip emitter, and a microspray. So these are all good for different types of settings in your home landscape or garden. I'm going to give you a quick breakdown of what each of these do and where you can put them in your landscape. So first off, micro bubblers are a great choice for container plants and plants that are still getting established in landscape beds. Using low pressure, they emit water from all points at the head, which allows a wider spread of water to be distributed to plant roots. They have the highest flow of all micro-irrigation options, but it's still going to be a lot lower than a traditional sprinkler head. You can get some that turn off when you rotate the head, which is very useful, especially when you have those new plants in your landscape bed that have just gotten established and no longer need as much water. So inline drip is a good choice for larger landscape beds with densely packed plants and around newly planted trees and bushes. So the tubing required for this type of micro-irrigation is called emitter tubing, and it's usually brown in color, and it has these little holes that are evenly spaced throughout the length of the tubing. So it's important to line these holes up with the plant roots that need regular watering. And you can just find all of these at your local home improvement store, and they'll be labeled accordingly. The third is drip emitters. So these are very commonly used to deliver a small amount of water directly to the plant roots. This drip emitter is attached to some black spaghetti tubing, but you can also buy drip emitters that attach directly to your main line. Lastly, micro sprays function similarly to a sprinkler, and they have to be above ground, and you can see it's attached to this little plastic stake, but they can deliver water up to 8 feet. They can even rotate like a typical sprinkler spray head does. While the spray can't reach large distances like regular sprinklers, they do have the longest range of any micro-irrigation emitter. Microsprays do best in gardens with a mix of landscape beds. So you can get kits that contain the microspray heads and stakes that are needed to suspend it above the ground, but the separate components are also available for sale. It's very easy to switch out microspray heads as your plant's water needs are going to change over time. You can get heads that deliver more or less water per hour, and of course this applies to all of the emitters I just mentioned outside of inline drip. It's very easy to just replace components as you need to. So now it's just the part where you assemble your pieces together. So attach your emitters to your system as you see fit. Feel free to play around a little bit. It's easy enough to switch things out. And once you're happy with the results, turn on your water source and watch your system run. While you're doing this, check for any leaks, clogged emitters, or running water. You're going to want to repair any of these problems if you see them. Otherwise, they might cause long-term damage to your system or plants. If you don't see anything wrong, congratulations, you have just successfully set up your drip irrigation system. How easy was that? So step 10, the final step, is to cover your system in mulch. And again, you don't have to do this, but it is certainly helpful for disguising the tubing in your landscape and retaining that moisture that you're getting from the drip system so that it lasts much longer than it would if it weren't mulched. So you can choose from many different kinds of Florida-friendly mulch. There's eucalyptus, pine bark, pine needles, fallen leaves, and mixed hardwood. And apply just enough mulch to cover your tubing. The key here is to not bury your tubes underground. It makes maintenance very difficult, and sometimes it can interfere with your system's ability to water. Not to mention, you risk introducing soil and dirt into your system, which could clog pipes or emitters. So mulch is a great alternative to disguising that tubing in your landscape. And like I said, helps retain water, which is always a good thing in Florida, especially in the dry season. So while you might be done setting up your system, keep in mind that you may need to replace parts, switch out heads, or readjust your system as your plant water needs change over time. Thankfully, and I've said this before, micro-irrigation systems are highly adaptable and don't require a whole lot to function properly. One thing to do is to blow out your lines every few months, especially if you notice that some of your emitters might be clogged. And you can do this by removing your end piece and turning on your system. We always recommend doing this with another person. Someone should be there to turn the system on, and then someone should be there to hold the tubing in place. Otherwise, the water pressure can sometimes cause the tubing to fly around, which can cause a little bit of a mess. So another tip is to use goof plugs to secure holes that are no longer in use. And those are just easy to get from any store, and they come in these little packs. So you don't have to buy a bunch of little packages. You can just kind of have, you know, your 10 or your 15 at once, and that's probably all you're going to need for a while. So now that I've walked you through the steps and you've seen the basics of system setup, here are some tips and tricks to help get you started. As I just mentioned, a big one is to keep your system maintained regularly. So clean those filters as you need to, take care of leaks when they happen. After all, there's no use wasting water with a system that's supposed to keep your water use low. That being said, install shutoff valves or choose products with built-in shutoff valves to help you better control your water flow. This is really useful if you plan on changing your watering pattern for any of your plant beds. After all, not every single plant is going to require the same amount of water each week, and things can constantly change in your landscape. So don't be afraid to switch out emitters too if your plants are getting too much or too little water. It's usually as simple as just replacing the part. If you find yourself making some mistakes when punching holes in your tubing, don't fret. All is not lost. Like I said in my previous slide, invest in some goof plugs to fix up the problem areas in your tubing. It's as easy as just shoving it into one of the holes, and the water pressure should make sure that there is no leaking that happens. Another tip is to use hose clamps at the base of your micro-irrigation system to keep tubing secure, and this will prevent water from leaking out. You can fit the hose clamp on the tubing before you attach it to any barbed connectors. Otherwise, it might be a little difficult to get on. So, micro-irrigation systems are generally pretty easy to set up, but help never hurts. So don't be afraid to recruit an extra set of hands to help you design your system, hold and locate parts, and provide emotional support as needed. And my last tip is to read product descriptions thoroughly when you're buying new components for your system. Make sure the pieces you buy are compatible with the diameter of your tubing. For instance, if you're getting fittings for your 1/2-inch mainline, check the label to make sure the part is meant for 1/2-inch tubing. It should have this information somewhere on the front of the packaging. So there you have it, folks, a basic guide to installing your own micro-irrigation system at home. If this all seems a little complicated to you, you can always start out with a simple drip irrigation kit from one of your local home improvement stores. From there, you can always add new components as you see fit. Otherwise, hopefully this presentation was a helpful place to start. Of course, if you have any questions about system installation or maintenance, or your outdoor water use in general, feel free to shoot me an email at jalebouitz@ufl.edu. Thanks so much for tuning in.